This webinar is part of a lecture series, which is a run-up to ActionAid's flagship event called the Urban Action School, which aims at bringing together activists, practitioners, working on a range of issues related to labor rights, entrepreneurship, urban poverty, livelihood, and urbanization. The Urban Action School hopes to establish over time knowledge in various disciplines by creating a forum for cross-sectoral learning. The Urban Action School facilitates cross-pollination of ideas, experiences between different activists and practitioners. I'm going to introduce the organizers, and then I'm going to also introduce a great supporter of this series. And the organizers are ActionAid and the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, JNU. We are supported by Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, South Asia. ActionAid is a part of a global federation with a presence in over 40 countries. It envisions a world without poverty, patriarchy, and injustice, wherein every person enjoys a dignified life. It works towards strengthening human rights and ensuring humanitarian response during disasters by encouraging both critical debates and on-field practices. CIRIC is a policy advocacy hub set up by ActionAid India, focusing on urban issues from the viewpoint of common citizens whose voices and interests should take priority in policies governing the city. We are partnered in this lecture series by the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, JNU. This center is created in JNU with a focus on teaching and research on labor processes, working conditions in the unorganized sector in contemporary world, particularly in developing countries. The objective of this center necessarily means that it is interdisciplinary, since any study of life of working people must draw on a whole range of disciplines, histories, economics, political studies, sociology, etc. I would like to invite Rajiv Kumar from Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, South Asia office, to introduce RLS to all of you.
Thank you, Katie. Greetings from Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung to all. I will briefly try to introduce RLS. RLS is a German-based political foundation working in India and South Asia and other parts of the world on the subjects of critical social analysis and civic education. It promotes a socialist, secular, and democratic social order and aims to present members of society with alternative approaches. Labor think tanks and support organizations, research organizations, and groups working for social emancipation are supported in their initiatives to develop models that have the potential to deliver social and economic justice. RLS has been active in South Asia since 2004, but the office in New Delhi was established in 2010 and got officially registered in 2012. Our main areas of work in India and South Asia are social transformation, agriculture, gender rights, and labor affairs. We are looking forward to a very meaningful panel discussion now with Professor Matthew, Professor Shyam Sundar, and Comrade Kaur. So that was a brief introduction about what RLS is. And I also thank Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, ActionAid and CIRIC to come together, collaborate, and make the panel discussion possible today. So thank you. Over to you, Katie, now. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Thank you for the introduction to the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Let's go into the program directly. Let me introduce the first speaker. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers as they come to speak. Our first speaker is Comrade Amarjit Kaur, who is the General Secretary of the All India Trade Union Congress. She's completed her MSc Physics from the University of Delhi in 1976. She's also done a graduation in law from Delhi University 79. Her activism began in school days, and she was active in various students' movements throughout her university days. She was the General Secretary of the All India Students' Federation at the national level from February 1979 to December 1985. She's worked for various women's movements and also held the position of the General Secretary of the National Federation of Indian Women. Ms. Kaur has stood in solidarity with trade union activities in Delhi University Karmachari Union and in the textile industry unions in 70s and 80s. In 1984, she was elected as the National Secretary of the AITUC in its national conference held in Patna. Then she was re-elected to the post. In December 17, she was elected to the post of General Secretary in AITUC's General Council meeting held in Ranchi, Jharkhand. And Ms. Kaur currently holds this position. We welcome her to this panel and request you to take the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this important panel on a very, very important question which is facing not only the working class of India, but it is the question which is facing the workers all over the world. The situation in COVID-19 and how we are trying to cope up and safeguard the rights of workers. Speaking from AITUC, we have entered into centenary. AITUC was founded in 1920 during freedom movement. So a long history of, at the world level of the labor movement to achieve their rights, including the right to 8 hours, fixed 8 hours, along with many other rights. But Indian working class history begins even much before that, when the sacrifice came for May Day celebration in Chicago. But if we look at our country, the first strike registered from the workers is in 1820s, and whole of 19th century we have registered hundreds of strikes in India, even though the unions started getting formed in the late part of 19th century. Then in the 20th century, the unionization began more vigorously. And by the time from 1900 to 1920, when AITUC was born, several of the unions in various sectors had been formed. And there again, hundreds of strikes have been registered in the history of labor movement. It is in this background that the working class of our country evolved from historical point of view, being a very inspiring source for the political movement, as well as being influenced by the freedom movement of our country. So it was vice versa, working class being influenced from the freedom movement, and the working class movement giving an impetus of unionizing, fighting, strikes, agitations, mobilization. So that is how the working class of our country has traveled these long years. In 1920, after formation of AITUC, in which unions from all sectors all over India, whosoever were unionized, they were called to Bombay, and the founder president was Lala Lajpat Rai. And then later on, even Pandit Nehru and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and B.V. Giri, even they presided over various sessions as presidents. They presided over the sessions of AITUC. So one can understand that the working class achieved those heights where it was a synonym to fight for our national freedom movement as well as to fight for our own rights. So Indian working class always looked at fighting for better situation for a whole lot of people of this country, for betterment of their lives also. So it was vice versa. So trade union movement in the country was never in contravention with the national interest, or in contravention post-independent India to the issue of national development. Rather, winning our rights even during British period, right to unionize as a legal right in 1926 when we got the Trade Union Act, or even before that Compensation Act in 1923, or 1861 we received, we had Factories Act which later on got amended after several of the interventions of the trade unions. It was amended. So several laws were achieved even during British period. There is credit to the Indian trade unions that in 1921 AITUC was the first organization in India which demanded for complete independence to be adopted as a slogan for India's freedom movement. Then it was the Indian trade union movement, means AITUC was the first to say that do not try to frame rules, India having some sort of a self-rule, but the British keeps ruling us as the main master. The AITUC had said that no, you have your own constituent assembly. Once you have adopted in 1929 a complete independence slogan, and we should proceed with that, that we will achieve independence of the country and we should have our own constituent assembly. Again, it goes to the credit of the working class of India that it was AITUC which submitted a long charter of demand to the political parties and also to the Constituent Assembly, where they talked about several rights, including right to dissent, opinion, right to freedom of expression, not only right to unions, it was there, right to equal pay for equal work, it was there, right to maternity benefit, it was there, right to children going to school and not at the workplace, it was there, right to democracy, the issue was raised, it was there. All those things were raised during that period by the working class of this country who wanted to see what kind of constitution we want to see in free India. Then in post-independent India, several of the rights were achieved through struggles and also through the supporters of the working class movement inside the parliament, who fought inside the parliament, and on streets the workers fought, and we got several legislations from our parliament, then also from state governments. But what we have found is that during COVID-19 period, all that history of the trade union movement is supposed to be wound up. It has to be rolled back. This is how the government is behaving. And I won't say it is so sudden that it is only in COVID-19. What I want to make a point is that since this regime came in 2014, we think they have contempt towards labor, and it got exposed during this whole process of COVID-19 and the lockdown, the way it was handled, how the working class suffered, especially those who go to other states or within their state to other districts, they go for work. And their number is not small. They are almost 200 million. Out of them, about 100 million are those who go to other states. 100 million are those who go within their state to different places after leaving their house. How the behavior was done with them, that contempt of this present regime towards working class is very clear. So from 2014 itself, we started facing problems as far as laws of the labor laws are concerned, laws which concern the labor movement. We started seeing the attitude of this government when they used Vasundhara Raje government to change 5 labor laws and then asking other state governments to fall in line and to change the labor laws as per Rajasthan Vasundhara Raje government had done. And several governments took that initiative. Based on that also, we know we have been fighting that. Then suddenly the government started pushing codification process, so 44 laws to be brought into 4 codes. And in every process we found tripartism, bipartism, everything was being undermined. International labor standards were being undermined. International commitments were being undermined. So this started even before COVID-19. Indian Labour Conference was held in 2015 and now we are in 2020 and Labour Conference has not happened in the country. Only with our lots of protest in 2018 they decided, but that also was taken back by saying Prime Minister is not free. So tripartism was under attack, bipartism was under attack, labour laws were under attack. But what happened in COVID-19, which exposed the government on all fronts? It has exposed the government on all fronts. And it has also exposed the precarious condition in which our working masses are. Vast majority of unorganized sector worker has suffered heavily. I'm not saying our job related workers have not suffered. They have also suffered immensely. Many of them now are finding their children leaving the schools where they were studying because they don't have protected wage now. Even jobs are going, joblessness is growing. Even on this job question also, I should say it is not something which is done because of COVID-19. It was happening since 2016 from demonetization period. So demonetization resulted into job losses and MSMEs suffering, trade suffering, and the workers suffering. With the GST, the way it was implemented, it further worsened the situation. By the time we entered into 2019 elections, Lok Sabha election, unemployment rate was rising in an unprecedented manner. In last 40 years, this has not happened. The gaps between rich and poor was rising, and then in 2019 elections, the fact came that 80 years ago, what was the gap between a richest person and the poorest person? India has gone back to that. Then also during that period, we knew that the economy is in bad shape. After the elections were over, the economy was suffering. There was a recession. Sector after sector, they were going down. They were not getting orders, and retrenchment started happening. Job losses started happening. So in this background, when COVID-19 came, the government, instead of correcting itself, went on its agenda. And on the one hand side, they are very reckless. This is exposed further badly. They are reckless when demonetization was announced. Even governor of RBI or the finance minister or the cabinet were not consulted. So किसी के मन में आया, and then at 8 o'clock in the night आपने थोप दिया, and 84 currency becomes a कागज का टुकड़ा. Plain sheet बन गया वो पेपर का. This is how it happened. And in this COVID situation also, they knew it from December. In January, it was declared as health emergency. First case entered India, or maybe might have entered before, but got exposed when a student from Wuhan in Kerala found COVID positive. And then in February, the cases were coming. The government failed in following all norms which WHO had told, or even our own epidemiologists were telling. All those things were not taken into consideration. Then the elections were going on in Delhi, environment was being vitiated, and then we find very targeted riots happened in Delhi, and then there were Trump Namaste program going on, and government was busy with that. So many people came from abroad, quarantine was not done, testing was not being done, all that was going on. Government of India wasted 4 months. When in parliament it was raised, stop the parliament, now the cases have started increasing. Then they were not listened to. Some people came with their mask in the parliament in middle of March. They were told by Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, "Aap bahar jaiye, mask bahar utar ke aiye." This was the seriousness of this government about this epidemic. And then they do Janta curfew, they do Tali, Thali, Dhali, then later on Diya, etc. Everything was done, all that drama. But they never gave even 6-7 days for our people to move back to their homes. Neither students, nor the workers, nor the pilgrims, nor the ordinary citizens who had gone for their personal visits and all. And this lockdown comes suddenly, क्योंकि नेताजी के यहाँ घुस गया और रात को बोल दिया, 4 घंटे का notice दिया. And after that, the whole story is known to everybody what all happened. I'm not going into it. But recklessness. Now the opening up of lockdown, again recklessness, and creating anarchy, and then throwing the responsibility on everybody else. State governments were not consulted, political parties were not consulted, working class was going to suffer lockdown, going to happen, industry was to close, everybody's job was to go, trade unions were not consulted, neither other mass movements or organizations consulted, one man show it began, and India's whole thing got locked down. And now we are in a crisis. And such a non-serious thing, 18 दिन में महाभारत जीत गया, 21 दिन में इससे जीतेंगे, and all kinds of myths were, superstitions were allowed to function. People were never trained and told what is to be done in this endemic. Neither the government prepared our health system, nor it prepared for whatever was required for our frontline fighters. All that we have seen what happened. But what happened after that? They came with some 5 days so-called package announcements. Earlier announcement of 15,000 crores for this health sector was very little, I should say. It was not sufficient. You needed between 1.5 lakh crore to 2 lakh crore to really look at the equipments needed for frontline fighters, plus health system to be revamped in a way that we could handle this situation. But all that was not done. It continues to be only 15,000 crore. It was there at that time when a few hundred cases were there. It continues to be that when we have crossed much more number than 50,000, 1 lakh nearing, crossing 1 lakh now, we might reach even 1 crore. But nothing addition in that came. And that for 20 lakh crore of thing, in the real sense is only 1 to 1.5 lakh crore only as the real investment if one talks of package. So in that, when we wanted all the payment as promises made, and as the Home Ministry also issued orders that workers should be paid for lockdown, instead of implementing the decision of the Labour Ministry or the Home Ministry, the order, they withdrew in Supreme Court. So the attitude is very clear. What was their attitude? Similarly, they said no retrenchment, no jobs will go. But the retrenchments are happening and did happen. They said rents will not have to be paid. But now every day these stories are coming, how they were denied to stay until they pay rent, and the government did not come for. We said about 40 crore people need 7,500 rupees per month, at least for 6 months. Government should come out, raise a demand, and see to it their hunger can be addressed. But it was not done. We said make PDS system as universal so that nobody dies hungry. Remember in 1890 to 97, people died and there was no dearth of grains during British period. We died during Bengal famine. There was no dearth of grains in India. But now also the government said bumper crop is there, but the people are dying of hunger. That situation has erupted. So job losses during COVID-19, and then whole situation of hunger is looming on the face. All those problems happened. So they addressed 4L. 4L is labor, to beat the labor. Labor laws under attack. 1,000 days UP government, 38 labor laws they suspend. Then Gujarat wants to suspend for 1,200 days. Madhya Pradesh government again several laws for 1,000 days. Other panelists will be more light. That's why I'm just touching these issues. 3 states openly came. We know Goa and Karnataka has prepared that kind of ordinance, but they have not brought to the fore. 8 to 12 hours international commitment was simply to be washed away. 10 state governments came out with their orders that they will make from 8 to 10 hours, 12 hours. Only Karnataka government and Rajasthan government have taken back. Others are still there intact. So the labor law changes was their agenda. To beat the labor was their agenda. So COVID-19 is being used as a cover so that they think no opposition will happen. They can go ahead. Similarly, L for land. Now all the policies which they have declared for rural India will be actually leading to corporatization of land, and it will lead to the finishing of 85% of the people who are in the farming sector, finishing them off. This is how they proceed. They talked of liquidity, and we already know what they are doing in liquidity. They will be creating situation where corporate houses will further benefit. It's not going to benefit as far as economy in that form is concerned, or the working people of this country. Law, they said, so they are lawless people. They are talking of law. They are using law only to silence the voices of opposition, silence the voices of movements, silence the voices of those who politically opposed, culturally opposed this government, and those who were defenders of Constitution, and those who were fighting against amendment into Citizenship Act. All excuses are being made, and some old cases being picked up, and some concocted FIRs, and then trying to push them into jail. So the government is nakedly come forward. They thought we will keep mum. We did not keep mum. We continuously were confronting Prime Minister, confronting Labour Ministry. We came on the streets. We observed our May Day. Independently, all trade unions took up their campaign program. On 22nd May, we jointly came and organized a nationwide protest. On 3rd July, again, we are going in a protest all over India, and this time even on the streets. And then on 1st June, our power sector unions observed all over India the protest day on the government policy of amending into electricity bill and privatization of power sector. Then 10th and 11th June, our coal unions, 2 days agitation they had, because the government is saying commercialization of mining, 41 mines to be commercialized, and Prime Minister saying we will earn 20,000 crores of rupees. I am really surprised, selling silver and gold of your house and getting very happy that we are going to earn this money. It is not earning, it is selling your own natural resources. So that is happened 2 days the campaign, but Prime Minister, instead of listening to that, said I myself will come to auction. So 18 June he decided to announce auction of our coal mines. That was the day unions chose to give a strike notice. So unions have given a strike notice for 2nd and 3rd and 4th July. Then they started their 100% FDI in various sectors. So in defense sector, they made it from 49% to 74%. So our defense unions raised their protest. And not only that, they have conducted a ballot on strike. 99% workforce has said, yes, we should go on strike. So maybe in middle of July, they will go on strike. Our ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, midday meal workers are planning for strike in the 3rd week of July. So what we are seeing is that today I read the news how these Bangalore women are grudging that we got passes for our buses. We want to go for work, but there is no transportation. Workers are walking for miles to go. Workers are not having transportation. Even despite those who got offer, 50% or 30% of the workers who got offer, even they are finding difficult to reach over there. So all those problems are there in the question answer. I will be able to add some more things, because I should not overshoot my time. I have already taken more time. I would like to just, this part of a discussion, I would like to say that the government has challenged the trade unions, and the trade unions are challenging the government. We are not lying low. We are organizing, and there is no way that they can stop us. We will fight back this government, because they are nakedly pursuing their agenda, and fully nobody is becoming poor as far as corporate sectors are concerned. Ambani has just now achieved, he is among 11 richest persons in this COVID period. He has 1,68,000 crores of rupees of his loan he has settled during this period. He has done some saudabaji with Facebook also, and he has gained some contracts in gas also. All these people are earning huge, even in this period, Amazon or Facebook, all these people are also earning huge. It's not that the corporates in the world and the corporates in India are not earning. They are earning, they are not in difficulty. Working class and the working masses are in difficulty. but we are not keeping it in a way that we will be sitting quietly and seeing the attacks. We are preparing ourselves. We will fight it back, and that is how we are trying to. And many places the government is being pushed back. Even this ordinance, we went to ILO, we complained there. Then the ILO Director General wrote to Prime Minister of India, and then the question was raised how you can run away from international commitments. Then we wrote second letter to ILO. We have sent some documents how central government itself is initiating and forcing the state governments to raise hours from 8 to 12 or ask for fixed term employment to be immediately implemented in your state. So at every level we will fight back. On streets we will fight and mobilize our people, and internationally wherever we can, we are going to raise our voice. That is definitely having some impact. Impact is our masses feeling confident they will fight. Impact is that the government could be halted to some extent after international intervention. So I end it here, I stop it here, and further when the question answer comes, I'll be.
Thank you very much. And there is one more round where I think we can also come back to the questions that you have raised as well. But thank you for bringing together a very, very incisive understanding of the context in which we are having this debate. And thank you very much for that. I will quickly now move on to introducing our next speaker, Professor Shyam Sunder, who is working as the Professor of Human Resources Management at the Xavier Labor Relations Institute, Xavier Business School in Jamshedpur. He holds a PhD in economics from Mumbai University. He has published over 60 research articles, books, reviews in the field of industrial relations, labor economics, in well-known research outlets in India. He has written extensively on labor law reforms and contemporary issues in the industrial relations, labor markets in India, and has written more than several articles in print and electronic media and Business Line, Business Standard, Financial Express, and on contemporary themes in the world of work. He's done several research projects for organizations like the International Labour Organization, both in Delhi as well as in Geneva, the European Union, the Global Union Federation, the Indian Council for Social Sciences Research, and so on. He's been a visiting fellow at the International Institute of Labour Studies, ILO Geneva. He was selected to visit China during November 2008 as a part of the cultural exchange program between India and China to study labor law reforms in China. He's been a referee for several peer-reviewed journals like the Indian Journal for Labor Economics, Development and Change, Industrial Law Journal, and for institutions like ICRIER, publishing houses like SAGE. He's on the editorial board of the Indian Journal for Labor Economics and Amity Journal for Economics. I invite Professor Shyam Sunder to speak to the issue around the failure of public policy, where he also will be looking at the role of the state, the absence of social dialogues with people's organizations, and more so with organizations, so that the interrogation of the so-called right-timed reforms argument, and for looking at the alternatives which are there in the context of urban informal labor. Professor Shyam Sunder, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good evening to all of you. And speaking after Comrade Amarjit Kaur is a tough ask, because she was full of fire and she spoke with such passion. But I am going to take a leaf from her very passionate delivery, as she argued very powerfully that the trade unions and labor laws date back to even the 19th century or the colonial period. I'm going to speak of a very well-known method of labor market governance, that is social dialogue. So I, of course, provocatively titled my speech as an obituary to social dialogue and dangers of unilateralism. I'm going to speak on the historical as well as recent developments with regard to what has happened to social dialogue in general and tripartism in particular. Next slide, please. Yeah, social dialogue. I mean, social dialogue I would like to introduce by referring to the International Labour Organization, which is a very unique UN body, because it is unique in the sense it is its governance structure is tripartite in nature. And in fact, as AITUC is celebrating its centenary, the ILO had completed its centenary in 2019, formed as it was after the First World War. And ILO defines social dialogue as all types of negotiations, consultation, or simple exchanges of information, both formal and informal, between or among the representatives of governments, of employers and of workers at several levels, be they at national level or regional level or industry level or at the firm level, on issues of common interest relating to economic and social policy. Social policy would largely include labor and the policy concerning the environment. Now, International Labour Standards Framework is given by the ILO, which largely comprises the ILO conventions, which once the member country ratifies become binding on them, the recommendations which are directive in nature, and of course the various paradigms that the International Labour Organization has issued from time to time. I'm going to touch upon briefly the decent work framework of the ILO. Now, there are two ways, there are two governance strategies or economic strategies or that one could find in the post-globalization period. One is a neoliberal strategy which individualizes and which is anti-collective and which seeks to weaken the collective rights of the collective organizations such as trade unions, non-governmental organizations, and all people-based organizations, which does not believe in social dialogue, which believes in the power of the market, which believes that the profit maximization should be the dominant objective, which also believes in the philosophy of state retrenchment, which was advocated by the Washington Consensus, and which is which philosophy is largely driving many countries in the world, and we are moving away from left to the center and left of the center to the centrist to the right of the center kind of a framework. Opposed to that is the institutional perspective, which is largely centered on the International Labour Organization's International Labour Standard Framework, which calls for a kind of a middle perspective to be driven, policy making to be driven by high labor standards, which should be framed and constructed on the philosophy of social dialogue, social justice, which believes in formulating or looking at possibilities of achieving golden equilibrium between equity and efficiency, which believes in enhancing workers' voices, worker rights, and at the same time increasing the economic efficiency. So this is the kind of an institutional perspective which talks about delivery of social justice, people-centered law-making, policy-making processes, and also at the same time not compromising on economic efficiency. Now, central to this International Labour Standard Framework is social dialogue, which is a method of labor market governance. Now, there are the ILO in 1998 formed the core labor standards or the fundamental labor rights, which largely centers on 4 subjects, namely the freedom of association, collective bargaining, the protection against discrimination, prevention of prohibition of child labor and forced labor. Now, there are 2 conventions which are of importance here, which is Freedom of Association and Right to Organize Convention 1948, which is Convention 87. And the second one is the Right to Organize and Collective Bargaining Convention, which is Convention 98. Of the 8 fundamental ILO conventions, India has ratified 6 ILO conventions, and the conventions 87 and 98 are yet to be ratified. Of course, India has ratified, no, Ananya, the previous one. For social dialogue, I would be focusing on the Tripartite Consultation International Labour Standards Convention 1976, which is C-144, and very importantly, Recommendation 205, which is Employment and Decent Work for Peace and Resilience Recommendation 2017. These two, one convention and one recommendation, has largely relied on social dialogue as a principal method of labor market governance and framing of labor laws and labor policies. And India has ratified Convention 144, and thereby we are bound to, the government at both levels, both the central and the state levels, bound to consult the social partners, namely the trade union representatives of workers' organizations, that is the central trade unions, and the employees' organizations. Next slide. Now I'm going to straight, because Professor Babu Matthew will be talking about the labor law changes. I'm just going to give it a context saying that, citing labor shortages or extraordinary COVID-19 times, economic distress, the need to attract investment, and to need to create employment given the high level of unemployment, various state governments in India, which Comrade Amarjit Kaur mentioned, elaborately, effected labor law changes in terms of raising the hours of work, or liberalizing the labor inspection system, or making substantial labor changes in the labor laws. I would say disruptive changes in the labor laws, particularly by Madhya Pradesh and also Uttar Pradesh. And as she said, Gujarat and Goa and Karnataka are likely to follow, or Gujarat has already sent the its ordinance to the government. UP and Gujarat have sent their ordinances to the government, which is pending President's assent. But the point to be noted is that the state governments have introduced disruptive labor law changes during the very troubled COVID-19 times in an unilateral manner, without referral to any kind of social dialogue mechanism. Next slide, please. Now, ILO has issued a detailed, policy document. It argues for four key pillars in tackling the COVID-19 crisis on the basis of international labor standards. We have four squares: stimulating the economy through fiscal and monetary policies, supporting jobs and enterprises through social protection and employment retention, protecting workers at the workplace by providing occupational security and health, access to paid leave, about which Comrade Amarjit Kaur talked about, and non-discrimination of any kind. But the fourth block is very important for my presentation, which is social dialogue, strengthen the capacity of the tripartite actors, and also strengthen the processes which are tripartism at the macro level and bipartisan at the firm level. Next slide, please. Now, social dialogue in India dates back to the colonial times. During the Second World War, the British government introduced two sets of consultation mechanisms. One is the social dialogue, namely the tripartite mechanism, and the other one is the Labor Ministers' Conference. The social dialogue could be further be classified as per the International Labour Organization's definition: tripartism and bipartisan. Tripartism could be statutory, and that is under the various labor laws. There are provisions, say, under the Minimum Wages Act or in the Contract Labor Regulation Abolition Act, and so on and so forth, to constitute statutory consultative boards, recommending boards. On the voluntary side, we have the Indian Labour Conference and its secretariat called Standing Labour Committee. Both were formed in 1940, and it had I'll come to that. It played a very major role in the shaping of the labor laws, which Comrade Kaur had mentioned elaborately. At the state level, the government also thought, the government of India also conceived the state labor advisory boards. And of course, we have tripartite industry committees. And also we have the Labour Ministers' Conference, which was largely conceived by the British government to bring about uniformity in the legislation across the states. Both are very important in today's context, and I'll tell you how they have been ignored. Next, please. So I'm providing a very broad, sweeping classification of tripartism. I'm going to talk only of tripartism component of social dialogue. I'm going to speak about the role of state in indirectly and the regime differences directly. 1940 to 69, there was parity between state, labor, and capital, which is all about tripartism, and it was a welfare state which respected the constitution. And social dialogue, particularly tripartism, played a very creative role in terms of advising the government to frame labor laws and labor policies. In fact, the Planning Commission of India consulted workers' organizations during the formulation of the 5-year plans. And it produced a rich output of various central labor laws. 1950s and 1960s are called the decade, late 40s to late 60s are called the decades of labor regulation. And during this period, 26 Indian labor conferences were held. Then we come and post that 1972 to 1991, there was a lull in Indian labor conference. Tripartism was not active. And 1992 to 2014, there was a dominantly coalition politics, and the state was playing safe in terms of not introducing core labor law reforms about hire and fire and closure and labor flexibility, with Comrade Kaur has talked about. Though it was neoliberal largely in character because it introduced the liberalization and privatization policies in a consolidated sense. 16 Indian labor conferences were held during this period, and a couple of commissions were set up, the Second National Commission on Labor and the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. But no core labor law reforms could be introduced. 2015 was the only time the Indian Labor Conference was held, and it was now from 2014 to 18 we have and 18 onwards we have a majoritarian party in leading the coalition of NDA. From 1940 to 69, where there was parity between the three partners and where labor was consulted largely, now it has become G2B. Government to business has become very dominant. And there is in place an aggressive and impatient state to introduce labor flexibility reforms. So there is no effective social dialogue. And at the regional level, which I'm sure Professor Matthew would speak in greater detail, core labor law reforms providing for labor law flexibility, even suspension of labor laws have been undertaken. And the code, national level, the 4 codes have also been in the process. Wage code has already been passed. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, tripartism, previous one, sorry. Tripartism has largely failed in the neoliberal period. There are many factors, but I'm going to highlight only the few. Indian Labour Conference was largely used by the government to push through its neoliberal reform agenda and to criticize labor regulation. I remember reading Dr. Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Vajpayee, and even the Prime Minister Narendra Modi making pejorative references to labor inspection system as Labor Inspector Raj and asking for its abolition. And also very often saying that the labor laws they only relate to a minority of workforce, namely 7 to 8% of the workforce, and there is a larger need to address the concerns of the unorganized sector. So there is a kind of a segmentation of labor market that took place in the discourses, pitting the unorganized sector against the organized sector, and paying lip services to ensuring labor interests and consulting trade unions before introducing the labor law reforms. This was a constant running theme in all the utterances by the government, either from the bureaucrats, the labor secretary, or the labor minister, or even the prime minister. And the trade unions have alleged, not without truth, that even the unanimous recommendations of the conference tripartite committees were not implemented by the government. The 2 examples that have been given are the minimum wage, the need to enforce the Indian Labour Conference 1957 recommendations concerning the construction of minimum wage, calculation of minimum wage, and absorbing the Anganwadi workers. And at the same time, the neoliberal law reforms had brought about a kind of a class solidarity. With due apologies to the organized workers movement, the trade union movement has been largely fragmented. For a long time, it was a left-initiated national countrywide struggles. But from 2010-11 thereabouts, a kind of consolidation took place, which of course is now facing some issues. I'm sure the labor movement will sort these issues out. As academics, we are interested in seeing a coordinated trade union movement maturing into a people's movement like the National Platform for Mass Organizations, which I'm sure the trade unions would have to think about in terms of constructing social movement unionism. But many of the consultations were outside tripartism, that is government to business. And concrete, effective policy and labor law related outcomes were generated because of the submissions given by various industry bodies. I have, through my research, identified a couple of labor law policy primers given by the Confederation of Indian Industry and FICCI, to mention the two. I'm also aware, and I'm in touch with the central trade unions. They have given numerous submissions to the government, even during as the codes were being made, but not many of their concerns have been addressed in the codes, which would require a separate webinar altogether. Since 2015, as Comrade Kaur has mentioned, there has not been Indian Labour Conference, save for an effort in 2018. Next slide, please. Now, I would call that the labor law making, or even the policy making, or even the relief measures announcement as neo-unilateralism. Now, why do I call it as neo-unilateralism? Unilateralism would mean that the state is not consulting either of the social partners, that is the employers' organizations and the workers' organizations. But it is given the character of this regime, which is neoliberal in character, where the state has interests which are synonymous with those of the business. They could be clubbed into a common interest group, and thereby the state actions largely reflect those of the business industry's concerns, and to a very minority, to a very minor extent, that of the welfare of the workers. So I have in order to differentiate between perfect unilateralism and kind of a nuanced unilateralism, I call it as a neo-unilateralism. That is, and in this, because the government does not want to either listen to the intellectuals, nor any commissions or committees, nor the trade unions' voices. It goes about making labor laws and policies listening to only one voice. Next, and I call this as neo-unilateralism of the neoliberal regime. Next slide, please. So there are two propositions of the neoliberal logic. It's a globalized economy. There is a need for quick labor law reforms. Ease of doing business is much more important than the labor rights. So there is a tremendous need for flexible labor laws, which is not entirely untrue, being an academician. And how do we go about introducing the labor law reforms? Social dialogue is costly, frustrating, time-consuming, so it can be dispensed with, which is consistent with the neoliberal regime. There are three scenarios for social dialogue. Where trade unions are strong, which is at the national level, there is a coordinated union movement. Keep the social dialogue alive, tripartism alive, have symbolic consultations. In fact, the IR code on which I am writing a paper for Economic and Political Weekly clearly mentions that the IR code has been framed with the consultations with the trade unions and the employers' organizations. Where trade unions are fragmented, this is where the trade union movement has to really look at. They are concentrating at the national level and losing at the state level, where the political fragmentation is very high. So avoid or ignore social dialogue. I'm afraid the State Labor Advisory Board is either not functional or least functional. And at the firm level, allow the market forces, product market and the labor market, to function, and the collective bargaining outcomes will be decided by the relative bargaining power of capital vis-a-vis the labor. Or it can also lead to union consultation in good firms like Tata Steel, Mahindra, and other firms. On the other hand, to union busting or avoidance of unions, which everybody knows. So the reform spaces are primarily at the national level. It's still to take place, but in the meanwhile, at the regional level, which are faster, and at the micro level, where social dialogue is either absent or subject to market dynamics. Next slide, please. So the hazards of unilateralism, the labor market outcomes are not optimal outcomes. Neglect or failure of tripartism will lead to unilateral determination, of course in consultation with industry. Use of non-legislative methods like ordinances and government orders. Fixed-term employment was issued through a government ordinance in March 2018, and various state governments have adopted ordinances. And even the Industrial Relations Code, Chapter 10, allows the state governments to modify the threshold for Chapter 5B in the ID Act, Chapter 10 in the Industrial Relations Code by executive order. Mediocre outcomes. This is where I want the the society to wake up and listen. Take cognizance of. There are neo-unilateralism will lead to mediocre outcomes. Changes are often mostly slanted towards one side because the state listens to only the one side, the capital, and of course it produces low labor standards or weak or no labor institutions. Secondly, it leads to a mediocre governance regime, and the state is in a hurry to pass the labor laws which are poorly drafted. The UP ordinance is a classic case. I'm sure Professor Babu Matthew will be appalled as a long-standing professor of labor law. It is the 1.5 pages of legislation. In fact, the central government had to send a correspondence to the government of Uttar Pradesh and government of Gujarat, asking them which are the labor laws they want to exempt from. This is the level of mediocrity that India has never witnessed. India is known for its bureaucracy and hesitance to seek ILO's technical cooperation. I have visited China, and the labor contract law has been made in 2007-8. And I learned from the from the social partners there that the government of China consulted International Labour Organization and also consulted the public in framing the labor law contract law, which is a very significant labor law reform that took place. Government of India must consult ILO's technical cooperation. It has the global expertise in order to draft these labor laws, and of course the trade unions are already urging the government to do so. Next one, please. Next one. So voice deficits leads to all kinds of mediocre outcomes and race to bottom of labor standards, rising informality, diminution of labor welfare, weakening of aggregate demand leading because of underemployment due to informality, unemployment, and lower levels of income. And lower levels of income of the households lead to lower level of savings by the households. And lower levels of savings means lower capital formation, which is material capital formation, and lower level of human capital investment. Imagine contract workers, daily wage earners with less than minimum wages, around the minimum wages, spending money for their children's education, health, nutrition. So it is going to create a society in the next 30 years, a society which is not sound on human capital. So the low wage, cheap labor capital strategy of the neoliberalism is not only going to hurt, is not only going to promote suboptimal outcomes in the present, but also suboptimal outcomes in the future. I urge the trade union movement to take this particular dimension of not only the the problem with the present, the contemporary problems, but also the futuristic problems, and it leads to poor labor market governance. ILO is very clear in his advice, as we saw earlier, that sound labor market governance means listening to the social partners and going by consensus and evidence-based social dialogue. I urge all parties concerned as an academician to revive social dialogue and frame labor law policies, social and economic policies, which promote at once equity and economic efficiency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shamsundar. Thank you very much for elucidating the details which are necessary for us to go into the discussion much more clearly. I think this dimension that you brought through is very, very important, and it will lead to where Professor Babu Matthew is going to speak to as well. Having said that, may I introduce Professor Babu Matthew? who has been a faculty member of National Law School of India University right from its founding days. He has taught legal methods, law, poverty and development, labor law to graduate students. He was instrumental in setting up the Center for Child and the Law and the Center for Labor Studies. He held the Government of India chair on juvenile justice. He was the registrar of the National Law School during which time the International Training Center was established as a successful profit center of the university. He was awarded the Nehru Fellowship, which facilitated research into public sector and led to the first PIL against disinvestment in Karnataka High Court. He then went on to deputation from the National Law School of India to become the country director of ActionAid Association International in India, in which capacity he popularized the use of rights-based approach at the grassroots in partnership with more than 400 civil society organizations spread across 24 states in India. This has also led to the preparation of the shadow report on ESCR presented before the UN Council in Geneva. Professor Matthew, amongst many of his achievements, presently teaches in the Master of Public Policy program, for which he's also the chairperson along with the Institute for Public Policy. He's also in charge of the Center for Labor Studies at NLSUI. This is a brief introduction to Professor Babu Matthew. Professor Matthew has suggested that he would look at one end of the spectrum by focusing on one issue, namely the wage issue. And he would like to make a specific reference to the new Wage Code 2019. Professor Matthew, the floor is all yours now.
Thank you, Suresh, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to renew my friendship with ActionAid, with the AITUC through Comrade Amarjit Kaur, and with the academic world through Professor Shyam Sundar. It's indeed quite a challenging agenda to even encapsulate what all labor reforms are going on. And that's the reason I volunteered to focus on it, just one such code. Well, one reason why I could pick up the wage code is above all because it has already become law as compared to the other three which are waiting in the wings. But encouraged by Professor Shyam Sundar's remarks, I'm going to try and take the minimum possible time in order to refer to the other three codes also at the outset so that an overall picture is available before the audience. So far as the Industrial Relations Code is concerned, I think the biggest damage that this code does is to the long-standing institution of collective bargaining. I don't think those who are in power understand that collective bargaining helps even capitalism. That the golden era of capitalism in the Western world is actually built around collective bargaining. And we know that if you want collective bargaining, you must have a trade union, which is worth its name. And so when trade unions raise their demands and sign a collective bargaining agreement, then wages goes into the hands of the workers. And when wages goes into the hands of the population, it creates purchasing capacity. So if you want to overcome the present crisis, the most important thing they must recognize in terms of pure economics, it's not socialism or communism. I repeat, in terms of capitalism, if you want capitalism to pick up, especially friends in UP and Madhya Pradesh, they seem to have a feudal point of view and want to develop capitalism in their states. They are sadly mistaken. That's not how political economy works. So what does this law do? It seeks to replace collective bargaining with arbitration. I would go so far as to say arbitration is like privatization of dispute settlement. And that cannot be an alternative for industrial relations. And the worst thing they do is that they put a pabandi, a big kind of a restraint on the right to strike. Can you believe it? India may be perhaps among the very few countries in the world which has now made the right to strike illegal. You should take note of the fact that if the present law goes through in its proposed bill form, then the right to strike will become, you can't have a legal strike in India. You can't be a part of the ILO and take a view which is so absurd in its nature. It goes a step further. If workers go on strike, then the union can be deregistered. So if you take all this together, you understand what the Industrial Relations Code is dealing with. Fortunately, during the recent period, I think, some people are advising them that this sounds very crazy. So the right to recognition is brought in. But while the right to recognition is brought in, they're afraid of the secret ballot. And so they remain silent on it. But they go ahead to say that if you want to be a sole negotiating agent, you must get 75% of the votes. By what democratic standard can you impose 75% mandate to run an institution? There would be no government in India after independence if you said that the minimum mandate required is 75%. Let alone this government. No government, even in the past, had that kind of a mandate. So this is an absolutely undemocratic proposal, and I hope that before they bring it to Parliament, they'll have second thoughts about it. They also do away with the technique of reference. It's an important ingredient of the Industrial Disputes Act, and I'm not sure whether they understand the consequences of such steps. I leave the Industrial Relations Code at that. If you look at the Social Security Code, how should one summarize that is a question that comes to my mind. I'll do it in the following manner. If you take the Employees' State Insurance, along with it, if you add the Employees' Provident Fund Act, then it covers 9 standards that the ILO has laid down as very good social security standards. And what does this code do? It simply says that 93% of the Indian workforce will not be entitled to the social security measures. So what kind of social security are you talking about? You can see the consequences of that when you look at the condition of migrant labor. There's more to it, but for lack of time. If you look at the third code, the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, I think the most outstanding feature of it is the most outlandish feature. And that is that you have discarded the global standard of 8 hours of work. Amarjit Kaur referred to the history of the agitation for 8 hours. Convention number 1 of the ILO in 1919 deals with 8 hours of work. In 1942, Ambedkar, I think it's 46, I'm sorry, Ambedkar as Labour Minister in the Viceroy's Council, he moved an amendment to make 8 hours work the standard, and that is how we had won those rights. That is sought to be done away. And even worse is the idea that it will not be the legislature which will decide what is the hours of work. It's left to the delegated legislation. It's left to prescribed government's action. And that is actually against the principles of administrative law. That is what the Supreme Court called as abdication of legislative function. It's for the legislature to prescribe policy. You can't leave it to the administration. The biggest syndrome in all these 4 codes is that the legislature backs off and then leaves it to the administration to do what it wants. So that is the whole process of trying to prepare codes. I think the sad part of it is that India has had a very advanced labor jurisprudence. And I'm not going into the rest, but this is true in the field of wage determination as well. So the purpose of writing a code, is in order to bring all legal instruments on a particular subject together. In fact, the grand codes go even beyond. I suppose the grandest code is, code of Napoleon in 1804. And that's a code which seeks to bring together not only civil law, even criminal law. There are similarly during the Hammurabi Code, it's also referred to as the Babylonian Code. There's the Code of Justinian, which brings together Roman law in 529 BC. There's the German Civil Code. There's the Swiss Civil Code. There's the Japanese Civil Code. So in other words, I'm saying the process of writing a code, I think, has been misunderstood by our friends in India. They are not talking of a code of that nature. They have descended on labor. And I don't think there are countries in the world which have written a labor code. And I suppose as they attempted to do this, they realized that they have to have 4 labor codes. If you believe really in the process of code replacing legislation, why didn't you think of one code for the whole of labor law? You realize that the manner in which India has won these rights is very different. When it comes to labor, you have to respond to local conditions. You have to make sure that you understand the nature of the industry. You must find out what are the profit margins. Some of the workers who get the highest wages in India, they may be, consuming only 1% of the turnover of that industry. If there is such a huge profit margin, why should you say that they shouldn't get a decent wage? And you have to consider what is the nature of labor. You cannot afford to ignore the conditions of migrant labor when you are proposing labor codes. They've done that. This is not an example from the air. The Interstate Migrant Workers Act is proposed to be repealed. And that shows the insensitivity. Do you think a labor code can take care of the problems that arise when you have to deal with a specific question like the interstate migrant workers issues? It is, to be remembered that the law that exists now, especially even now, because Parliament has not yet acted, it brings together existing practices. Existing practices which have been modified through collective bargaining. Collective bargaining involves the energies of so many sections. It's not just the trade union. Some of the best representatives of Indian capital sit across the negotiating table. Is the chief executive of the company, the finance director of the company, the person in charge of marketing, the person in charge of production. That is how a collective bargaining agreement is arrived at. And if India has done well in industry, Bangalore is a place where industrialization has been very successful. I can tell you, all the best industries in Bangalore are also the ones that have signed the best collective bargaining agreements. Through good collective bargaining agreements, industry has done well. They've been able to pay 20% bonus. And so this idea that destroying such a lovely framework is necessary for industrialization is crazy. It's ill-informed. There is a great labor law jurist who is recognized across the world. His name is Otto von Freund. And he makes a statement that the individual contract of employment is replaced by the collective contract of employment. And that is labor law's greatest contribution to world jurisprudence. So it's that kind of a thing which is sought to be reversed. We have had adjudication. We have had the Labour Appellate Tribunal. We have had so many commissions. The Royal Commission on Labour, the Gajendra Gadkar's Commission, the Second National Labour Commission, the NCEUS. We have had judgments of the Supreme Court. We've had so many tripartite conferences. Amarjit Kaur referred to some of them. You see, the last one was the 45th National Tripartite Labour Conference. What is a Tripartite Labour Conference? It brings together the captains of Indian industry. They are not ill-informed people. And then the trade unions and the government. And they arrive at unanimous decisions. The 15th Indian Labour Conference lays down the standards for arriving at the minimum wage. How can you simply ignore all this and think that we can go ahead? I think one way of capturing it is they've developed a fetish that they must write codes. And as a result, they have attempted this crazy thing. And 90% of what they have reproduced in these codes is cut and paste. And a hopeless cut and paste job for the reason that the earlier laws were framed within the framework of a social welfare state. Whereas now you have moved to a neoliberal state. And so how can you cut and paste from, during the period of neoliberalism from the earlier period? And this results in contradictions, which are, glaring contradictions when you look at the type of legislation that's coming through. Let me then go on to examine the code on wages. I wanted to get into the details of at least one code. And for lack of time, I thought I'll do this because of the importance of the wage question. And I repeat, the importance of the wage question is, it's not only important for working people, for the working class, it's also extremely important for the country. There is nearly unanimous opinion that the demand side must be stimulated. And the Finance Minister of India is unfortunately stimulating the supply side. And we've seen the result of it. It's not producing anything. How can industry produce if there are no people to buy? And if you want to buy things, please address the wage question in a more intelligent manner. There is no correlation between political economy and labor law reforms which are being bandied about. It's very sad to note that, even if you look at the wage code, what does it do? It brings together Payment of Wages Act, Minimum Wages Act, Equal Remuneration Act, and Bonus Act. That's not even exhaustive of wage determination in India at present. How can you then call it a code? The expression code is a misnomer. They are not aware, is it, that wages in India is determined by collective bargaining, by conciliation, by adjudication, by wage boards, by arbitration. So all this is forgotten. So it's a very strange attitude that we see. Be that as it may, I want to go a step further into analysis of this code. And I therefore pick up the crux of it. The crux of this code is that it introduces two types of wages. One is the minimum wage, which already existed under the Minimum Wage Act 1948, but it also introduces the floor wage. So while I have this criticism of labor law, here is an aspect which I will welcome. Let me say very clearly, I welcome a floor wage. And this legislation proposes a floor wage. And the law says it can be either a national level floor wage or it can be for different geographical areas. Be it so, that's a very welcome idea. But while saying that minimum wages will continue, this is the problem of cut and paste, in my opinion. They have decided that you don't need scheduled employment. Anybody who is familiar with minimum wages in this country knows that a minimum wage is notified in respect of a scheduled employment. And over the last more than 60 years, the Minimum Wages Act has brought into effect schedules numbering nearly 2,000, a little less than 2,000. And so that has happened across so many states in India because it's the appropriate government which decides to notify a schedule. And under that schedule, a minimum wage notification is made. This strange law, it it repeals this provision. And at the same time, you see their dilemma. They say, even if we arrive at a floor wage, we will still make sure that the existing minimum wage is protected. That's a right step. It shows their unresolved contradictions. But they're not able to say that in future notifications of scheduled employments will continue. So not only does this law say that the appropriate government must fix minimum wage, it goes to the extent of saying that you can use the methods that were prescribed under the 1948 Act. And what was the method? You had two methods. One is called the committee method and the other is called the notification method. And if you use the notification method, then you must consult the advisory body. And the advisory committee consists of employers, consists of employees, consists of women, a very welcome feature, consists of experts, and consists of government. Now, what's the idea of creating an advisory committee? That means you say that you need an expert body in order to advise how the wages should be arrived at. And after that, you say, as may be prescribed. You want to leave the determination of minimum wages to a method of prescription. This is, in my opinion, clearly illegal for the reasons that I already referred to. Let me come to the floor wage. I said I welcome floor wage. Why? Because not all of employment in India is covered by minimum wages. We all know that. There are so many employments in India which don't get any protected wage. So good, if you can protect them, please go ahead and do so. But what is going to be the amount? The Honorable Labour Minister, I don't know if he said it accidentally or deliberately, he said that it will be 178 rupees per day. Whereas the government appointed its own committee. If experts were, friends from that Labour Institute were there. And then in addition, at the same time, there was a Rangarajan committee. And both these committees, appointed for different purposes, one precisely for wage determination, arrived at 375 rupees. So my caveat is the following. I welcome a national floor level wage or a floor level wage which is different for different regions. Let the concerned state governments come together and fix a floor level wage for their region, but it can't be less than rupees 375. Why? Because your own expert committee has recommended that level after doing a lot of exercise. And the Rangarajan committee, in my opinion, this is something we must take special note of and work on it even more. That was a committee appointed in order to determine what should be the poverty line in India. And I would think that's most appropriate. Will you, for God's sake, fix a floor level wage which will take people above the poverty line? That's a good goal to aspire for. But if you say 178 rupees, then you will push poverty people into penury. You will push them into further destitution. Of course, it looks like the government doesn't care because migrant workers have been denied wages for now it's coming to about 3 months. Even though the Home Ministry said that they must be paid wages, nobody bothered about it. What are these great employers? Every day they go and request the finance minister to give them more concessions. But never will they say, okay, during this period we'll pay wages to the workers. I think that disconnect, makes Indian capital must bow its head in shame. So we must, I feel, propose an amendment to this code, wage code. And that is in order to also in the interest of our economy. It would be incomplete on my part not to refer to minimum wage because that's also part of it. But it is wrong for this law to remain silent on how the minimum wage should be fixed. And you don't have to discover anything new. We all know the 15th Indian Labour Conference has laid down all the yardsticks necessary. Those who are familiar with this are so familiar, it would be highly redundant for me to mention it. And so I take it that, I must, however, draw attention to the fact that the 15th ILC Mind you, it's a unanimous recommendation of the 15th ILC. Recommended 2,700 calories. Current experts are happy with the 2,400, maybe even with 2,100, maybe go below 2,000 also. But there is an interesting inconsistency. When they talked about the 7th Pay Commission and fixed their minimum wage, they accepted 2,700 calories. Hello, if those who sit in the central government, that is what is described as sedentary work. Whereas those who are engaged in scheduled employments, who work in the quarries and on the roads, they are not even moderate. They are working in heavy kind of conditions. And therefore, for them, 2,700 is not enough. It will have to be much more. So here is another inconsistency that shows up. But, you know, we are all more familiar with the Reptocos case. And I welcome the Reptocos case because it added another 25%. But please note, there is an even more important Supreme Court judgment in India. It is called Unnichoi versus State of Kerala. And that is the only constitution bench decision on minimum wage so far. So you can't afford to ignore that judgment. And that judgment elaborately considered everything connected with the minimum wage. Employers wanted to challenge the Minimum Wage Act itself. The Supreme Court upheld it. And Supreme Court said, you must apply the yardstick of the 15th Indian Labour Conference. They've gone to the extent of saying, if you can't run an industry by paying minimum wage, you don't have a right to run an industry. The tile factory owners of Kerala tried to shut down their tile factory for a few days during this case. But Kerala government did not oblige them. And so the minimum wages was not only paid, tile industry continued to make profits. I'll close at this with just one last observation. And my last observation is, you know, because we are so angry with this government and its anti-labor practices, there is a trend among us to get into rejectionism. I would caution, don't get into rejectionism. Examine every piece of the stupid law that is proposed and propose amendments to it. We need to get into critical engagement even with these bad laws. And I think in respect of that, you know, we must not only look at the procedure, but also about the substantial content of it. And for lack of time, I won't get into it. But from the point of view of the content, we are in a very interesting period of Indian history. It is similar to the history during our independence struggle. The leaders of the independence movement and the leaders of the working class movement were on the same page. It is a similar period. Those who want to build a new India in which the economic crisis is solved and the trade union is on the same page. And the most important thing is, please address the demand side of issues. It's not a communist point of view. It's a point of view of the most established economists who have been advising even the Prime Minister of India. So it's time they wake up and take a look at all these, because there is still scope for surviving and for developing democratic dimensions in our struggle. Thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Babu Matthew. I mean, it was a deep dive into understanding also the mechanics and the intricacies that you brought to the fore in understanding through the minimum wages code the central ideas that we must also work with. And I completely agree with you about the view that we must examine, and we should not use rejectionism as the first basis of engagement. Although there are significant things where we would have an opposition to, but we must still engage with them. Thank you so much for that brilliant exposition. And I think that if we look at the series of discussions that we've had, starting with Comrade Kaur, with Professor Shamsundar, to yours, there's a clear line of thinking that's also emerging for all our participants. So the first set of questions that are there are for Comrade Kaur, and they are in relation to the fact that, you know, the questions are around why are there not as much unionizing efforts in the informal sector, which is seen as one of the sectors which has really been struggling, especially if you look at also the post-COVID context. There has been also a question for you, Comrade Kaur, which is the role of trade unions in the present scenario amongst regressive labor reforms in some of the states. I think you have alluded to that in your opening comments, but maybe you might want to add a little bit more to that. I am also going to read out some of the questions for Professor Sundar, so because that is also available now. Professor Babu Matthew, I think some of the questions are still being formulated right now. For Professor Shyamsundar, the question has been, what has been the impact of labor law changes which have been made by Rajasthan, but also states like Andhra and Maharashtra over the past few years prior to COVID-19? Has it achieved stated objectives of more investment? What has been the impact on working conditions on the other hand? So that's been a very clear question for you. Another question is, how are we going to look at ILO's work in this context? I mean, what is its role? What is its position? Professor Matthew did refer to some aspects of it, but I think if you might want to speak to that a little bit more. So these are the questions that I have at the moment. Professor Matthew, I'll come back to you as the questions are coming in. This is for Comrade Kaur and Professor Shyamsundar. 2 to 3 minutes, and please also conclude your statements. Thank you, Comrade Kaur.
I enjoyed talks by Shyamsundar and Babu Matthew, informative and very good talk my co-panelists gave. As regard question on informal sector economy workers to be organized, there is a myth as if our membership comes from the organized sector only. Rather, 70 to 80% membership of our unions comes from informal sector. So we have been organizing informal sector, and it is working for them that several of the laws could be achieved for addressing these sectors only. Formal sector unions, we know, are capable enough to go into their systems the way they have evolved, seeking the settlements and all. But the real battle is for the informal sector workers. So we do organize, but organizing them is not an easy thing. I give you only 2 examples. One is all the construction workers, when we organize them at any place, they are of migratory nature. They are there for 6 months or 1 year, and then they move to another state. So it's not an easy thing. How to have it connecting with the other states' unions is a big issue. And not only construction, all those workers who are of migratory nature, only those fixed with the particular industry and they are there and working, they are part of our unions and they get mobilized. But vast majority of unorganized sector workforce is of migratory nature, be it agriculture sector or be it other unorganized sector workforce. So it's quite a tough thing, even in industrial hubs where the units are not registered factories. Even there, to organize a union there at that workplace will be inviting that the workers will not get jobs very next day, they will be removed. So we find out other methods of seeing to it how under umbrella organization they can be protected and their battle could be put up. So it's very difficult process as far as organizing informal sector is concerned, but definitely without organizing them, you cannot in the coming days, by organizing them more and more, you will not be in a position to save the working class movement. Second question I want to reply as far as trade unions where the state laws are being in Rajasthan, there was a big opposition and the government took it back. United opposition was put up in Karnataka by all the trade unions, so they withdrew their act. But UP government or Gujarat government and MP government, they don't want to listen, but there also the unions are gearing up. For example, in Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, united movement is being launched. We are saying that sector-wise also, state-wise also, and nation-wide also, this opposition has to come. Babu Matthew was telling that we should involve in critical engagement. Of course, we tried to get involved in critical engagement, and we found in the Labour Standing Committee of the Parliament, whatever suggestion we gave were just washed away and nothing was done. But that did not deter us for going into those meetings and saying over there. Only during small period we had to boycott when we found that they started misquoting even whatever we are saying in those meetings. But otherwise, critical engagement has to be there. I agree. Agitation and critical engagement in whatever law processes are happening, that is necessary. And raising all those issues which Shyam Sundar raised it, and the way he put it, of course, that perception of the whole thing at the international labor standards and the engagements with ILO and all, that needs to be emphasized more and more. In conclusion, I should say that these types of talks at least let us know more as far as we trade unions are concerned, through those who are engaged academically with this whole exercise. It definitely helps us, the trade union movements, to carry forward the whole debate within our ranks, also the trade union ranks. And lastly, while thanking for organizing this webinar, I would look forward that such kind of exercises should continue, because the days ahead are quite difficult days for us, and not only during COVID, post-COVID it is further going to be a big problem, because by that time this government will try to nullify as many laws as possible. So the difficulties are going to rise. So these exercises will definitely, these interactions will help us. I would like to thank the organizers, and if there are any questions which continue to be asked from we the trade unions, the organizers can provide my mail address to them, and we would like to be engaged with those questions. Definitely we'll try to give our viewpoint on those issues. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kaur. Professor Shyam Sundar, please.
Yeah, I'll just take 2 to 3 minutes because the questions are of very wide sweep. The impact of labor law reforms in Rajasthan or Andhra Pradesh or Haryana and all these, the impact of the reforms are under scrutiny. We require longer time series data to be able to say anything concrete, but with the limited evidence that we have at our disposal, I would say cautiously the jury is still out. That is to restate, it, the labor law reforms engineered and executed in these states have not necessarily, created the kind of outcomes that they anticipated. So that is answer number 1. Number 2, International Labour Organization has a number of functions. One of the very important functions is to provide technical cooperation to not only the member, not only to the social partners, but also to the government in a major way. International Labour, ILO being a global body, it has a huge technical expertise in various segments of industrial relations, and they would be, I mean, if the government of India approaches, or if trade unions through their ACTRA workers body approach the ILO, and as the central trade unions have already made a complaint, and the Director General had written an unusual letter to the Prime Minister in the history of ILO. So the trade unions could, in fact, through their ACTRA, invoke ILO's help, seek ILO's technical cooperation in order to redraft And we have excellent juries and law professors like Professor Babu Matthew and others, and ILO is there to provide technical assistance. It is only that the government has to ask. If the government doesn't ask, the trade unions have every right to ask, being a constituent member of the ILO's tripartite organization. I must thank ActionAid for this wonderful session. In fact, there is a thread, common thread running through from Comrade Kaur, me, and Professor Babu Matthew, and that is to say that we are in the process of nation making, and as responsible trade unions and as responsible academics, it is and also as responsible citizens, we need to be on caution, and we need to be in critical engagement, and that critical engagement is what is being done through these kind of webinars, and is a platform where social actors and academics meet, and it has been a very productive conversation, and I thank ActionAid and particularly the organizers for this wonderful session. I have enjoyed the passionate delivery by Comrade Kaur and eloquent delivery by Professor Babu Matthew. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Babu Matthew, you have the last words in the webinar, so to speak, and you're quite a person that we all look up to as well. There are two questions that have come up, which I am paraphrasing these questions. These are not directly the questions from the speakers. I think one of the questions is alluding to the arbitrary nature of the laws being so-called reformed, and you know, how can a response come to that? And the second one is around the wage code, where do you see, what kind of possibilities do you see for engagement at this state, at this time now? Is it at the state level? Is it at the rule making through, or is it through a judicial process? So these are two sets of questions which speak directly to some of the points you alluded to and your concluding remarks as well. Thank you.
I said, as always, we use multiple methods of addressing a problem. That's what I have learned also from my own trade union experience. And so the most important one finally is to take the message of these codes to the workers. The workers have already an idea, but we must demystify these codes, translate it into ordinary language, and let workers understand. And I think there's no better guarantee to fight anti-labor measures than for those who are the right holders to know what rights are being taken away. Yes, I think there is scope at different levels. So I would begin by identifying that if you look at the wage code, I would draw attention to section 42. And section 42 allows a board, an advisory board to be created, both at the national level and at the state level. And the composition of that board is employers, employees, independent persons, women, and government officials. So we must move and make sure that proper people get into these, consultative advisory board is extremely important within the framework of the wage code. And through that, then we can move in order to make our contributions. And I do think there is potential for that. I would also say that, yes, there's a huge dimension of arbitrariness built into the law. And I don't think it can pass through the judicial review process, because Indian administrative law is very old. We have, 7 decades of Supreme Court jurisprudence on some basic principles. And as I said, and I want to repeat it, when you make a law, the policy of that must be laid down by the legislature. It can't be left to the administrators. Whenever that has been left to the administrators, if you say the administrative machinery can decide policy matters, then the Supreme Court's beautiful statement has been, this amounts to abdication of legislative functions. You shall not abdicate your job. You are expected to do it. If you do abdicate, the entire legislation is struck down. You better take back the legislation to Parliament, you amend it and exercise your responsibility. Don't tell your administrators to do it. So in that sense, there is a scope for using multiple methods. And I think what you're now doing is also an important method. And I think during the COVID period, we must maximize this, use the digital media, convert it into multiple languages, translate all this and popularize these nice discussions. So there is a lot of scope.
Thank you very much, Babu Matthew. This has been as much a pleasure for me to listen to each one of you as it has been for you to listen to each other as well. And from what I see in the chat box and also the comments that are coming to me from my colleagues, it's been an extremely informative as well as educational. Well, it was supposed to be 90 minutes, but it's gone a little beyond that. But it's been extremely useful for all of us. I'd like to thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for the support for this series of webinars. I'd like to also thank all my colleagues who are in CIRIC, in the comms team, as well as the IT team, which has worked incessantly behind the scenes to keep the conversations going for all of us. And on this note, I must also thank each one of you as speakers for consenting to be here together this evening. So thank you very much. I take on board what you say about the need for further conversations like this and discussions like this. And that's hopefully what we will also try and do for the future. Thank you very much and have a good evening, each of you.
I want to especially thank my fellow panelists for the tremendous solidarity, and Amarjit, who is so busy, for her to stay through these more than 90 minutes, as Suresh says. Thank you all for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much.